Learn English through story. The Lover's Shadow. The air was thick with the scent of summer rain as Elise stepped out of the dimly lit cafe onto the cobblestone street. The drizzle clung to her skin, cool against the warmth of the evening, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the city breathe around her. It had been years since she last walked these streets, years since she had last seen him, and yet, no matter how much time passed, the weight of his presence never left her. She had been young then, naive, hopeful, and blind to the consequences of the heart's deepest desires. Raphael had been more than a lover. He had been a shadow lingering at the edges of her existence, never quite in the light, never fully hers. Their affair had been one of stolen nights and whispered promises, of passion that burned too brightly to last. But it had ended, as such things always do, with a wound that never truly healed. Now, as she walked through the narrow alleyways, past the old bookshop where they had once spent hours lost in conversation, past the bench where he had first taken her hand, Elise felt the past closing in around her. Was it fate that had brought her back? Or was it guilt? She was no longer the woman he had loved. Time had shaped her, carved away the innocence, replaced it with knowledge, some bitter, some sweet. But the question remained, had he changed as well? A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of rain and something else, something familiar. She turned, her breath catching as she saw a figure standing beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp. He had not moved, had not spoken, but she knew. Raphael. Her heart stuttered in her chest as memories rushed forward, threatening to drown her. Did he see her the same way? Did he remember? Or was she merely chasing shadows, hoping to find something that had never truly existed? The past had brought her here, but the future remained unwritten. And as she took a hesitant step forward, she wondered, was she walking toward redemption or ruin? The city seemed to hum around them, the faint glow of streetlights casting elongated shadows on the pavement. Elise's fingers trembled at her sides, a thousand emotions flooding through her as she took another step forward. Raphael had always been a man of silence, his presence more powerful than words. Now, as she faced him after all these years, the air between them felt just as charged as it had the last time they had stood this close. "Elise," he finally said, her name a whisper carried on the breeze. Her breath hitched. How many nights had she imagined this moment? How many times had she rehearsed what she would say if she ever saw him again? And yet, now that he was here, now that the past was staring her in the face, she found herself speechless. "You're back," he continued, his gaze unreadable. She nodded, struggling to find words. Yes. For work." It was a half-truth. Raphael tilted his head slightly, studying her as he always had, as if trying to decipher the things she wasn't saying. He had changed in ways time always demands, his face a little sharper, the lines at the corners of his eyes a little deeper, but the essence of him remained the same. The quiet intensity, the way his presence filled the space between them. "Work." His lips quirked into something resembling a smirk, but there was no humor in it. "And you found yourself here. I didn't expect to see you. Didn't you?" She hesitated. Maybe, on some level, she had hoped for this. Maybe that was why she had walked these streets, retracing the ghosts of what had been. "You look well," she said at last, hating how small her voice sounded. He exhaled, a sound that was neither amusement nor relief. "You left." The accusation in his tone wasn't sharp, but it carried weight. "I had to." "You didn't say goodbye." The past cracked open between them, raw and aching. She had left without a word, vanishing from his life as if their time together had been nothing more than a fleeting dream. But it had been real to real. That was why she had run. "I couldn't," she admitted. "If I had," she swallowed. "If I had, I wouldn't have been able to go." A flicker of something crossed his face, understanding, perhaps, or regret. "Elise." He said her name again, softer this time, as if testing its weight after all these years. And suddenly, she was back there standing in the moonlit room, where they had shared their last night together. Her fingers tangled in his hair, his breath warm against her skin. The memory was so vivid it was painful. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered, turning slightly, as if she could undo this moment. But Raphael reached out, his fingers closing gently around her wrist. The touch was light, hesitant, even, but it sent a current through her, just as it always had. "Stay," he said. It was a single word, but it unraveled everything. Stay, not just in this moment, but in the space between the past and the present, in the possibility of what they had lost or what they might still find. Her heart pounded. If she stayed, what would it mean? Was she willing to step back into the shadow she had fought so hard to escape? "Elise." His voice was quieter now, barely more than a breath. She looked up at him, her pulse hammering against her ribs. And then, in the hush of the rain-soaked night, she made a choice. She stayed. The night wrapped around them like a whispered secret, the air thick with unspoken words and the weight of old wounds. Elise had made her choice, she stayed. But as she stood there, inches from the man who had once unraveled her with nothing more than a look, she wondered if she had just undone years of careful distance. Raphael hadn't let go of her wrist yet, his fingers light but firm, as if he was afraid that if he loosened his grip, she would disappear again. She felt the heat of his touch seep into her skin, a ghost of the fire that had once burned between them. "Where have you been?" His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something raw. She hesitated, then exhaled. "Paris, mostly. A few years in Milan. Work took me everywhere. And yet, you came back here." Elise didn't know how to explain it. The city had always held a piece of her soul, a tether she couldn't quite sever. Maybe she had thought she could return and reclaim herself without facing him, without unearthing the past. But she should have known better. She searched his face, trying to decipher what he was thinking. Did he hate her for leaving? Had he moved on? Or had the years been just as cruel to him as they had been to her? Raphael's fingers finally slipped away from her wrist, but he didn't step back. "Come with me," he said, his voice quieter now. A part of her wanted to run to put distance between them, before she fell into old patterns, before she let herself believe in something that had already broken her once. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the warmth of his arms, and the way he had once made her feel invincible, couldn't resist. She nodded. He led her down the street, past familiar buildings that felt like echoes of another life. The rain had softened to a mist, clinging to her skin, making everything feel surreal. They walked in silence until they reached a small, tucked-away cafe. It was nearly empty, the dim lighting casting long shadows against the walls. It was the kind of place they had once escaped to, back when their love had been something forbidden and intoxicating, when every glance and touch had felt like a secret only they understood. They took a corner table. Raphael ordered coffee for both of them, the way he always had. She used to tease him about how predictable he was in small things, even when the world around them had been anything but. He watched her as the silence stretched between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, weighted with everything unsaid. "I thought about you," he said suddenly, his voice steady but low. "More than I should have." Elise's breath caught. She had spent years pretending she had let him go, that she had left him behind with the city she had abandoned. But she hadn't, not really. "I tried to forget you," she admitted. "But some people leave shadows that never fade." Raphael's gaze darkened. "Is that what I am to you? A shadow?" She swallowed hard. "A part of me." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Why did you leave, Elise?" The real reason. The truth had never been simple. It hadn't just been fear or guilt or the unbearable weight of loving someone she wasn't sure she could have forever. It had been all of it. She lowered her gaze. "Because I was afraid that if I stayed, I would lose myself in you." A muscle in his jaw tightened. And now, she wasn't sure if she had ever truly found herself without him. She reached for her coffee, wrapping her fingers around the warmth of the cup as if it could steady her. "I don't know." Raphael leaned forward slightly. "What do you want, Elise?" She looked at him then, really looked at him. The years had changed them both, but the pull between them was still there, undeniable, unshaken. "I don't know," she whispered again, but it was a lie. She knew, and so did he. The weight of Raphael's gaze pressed into her, demanding honesty in a way no one else ever had. He had always been like this, relentless in his pursuit of the truth, unwilling to settle for half answers. And now, after all these years, he still wanted one from her. Elise's fingers tightened around her cup, the heat seeping into her palms. What did she want? She wanted to stop feeling like a fragment of herself. She wanted to stop wondering if leaving him had been the right choice. She wanted him. The thought lodged itself in her chest, painful and undeniable. She set the cup down with deliberate care. "I don't know if wanting is enough," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. Raphael leaned back slightly, studying her. "It used to be." A bitter smile ghosted her lips. "We were younger then, reckless, believing love was enough to defy the world, wasn't it?" His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it, something aching. Elise swallowed. "No." He exhaled sharply, looking away for the first time since they had sat down. The silence between them stretched, not empty, but filled with everything they weren't saying. She thought of the way he had held her back then, how every moment between them had felt like a secret carved into the fabric of time. Love had never been the problem. It had been everything else: the fear, the circumstances, the weight of choices that had felt impossible. "I waited for you," Raphael said suddenly, his voice rough. "4 years, Elise." Her breath hitched. She hadn't expected that. "I tried to move on," he continued, his fingers curling into a fist on the table. "I told myself you weren't coming back, that I should stop looking for you in every shadow. But I never stopped." A sharp pang of guilt twisted in her chest. She had spent years convincing herself that leaving had been necessary, that it had been the only way to survive the depth of what she felt for him. But had she only been running from herself? "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. Raphael's jaw tightened. "Then why did you?" Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had no right to cry over wounds she had inflicted. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I stayed, I would never be able to leave. And I thought," as she hesitated, "I thought you deserved someone who could love you without fear." His lips pressed into a thin line. "That wasn't your decision to make." She looked down, unable to hold his gaze any longer. The silence stretched between them again, heavier this time. The cafe had emptied out even more, leaving only a few lingering patrons and the quiet hum of the city beyond the rain-washed windows. Finally, Raphael spoke again. "Do you still love me?" The question shattered the last of her defenses. Elise looked up at him, her pulse hammering. There was no point in lying, not now. "Yes," she breathed. His eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Then why are we still sitting here, pretending this isn't real?" Her heart pounded. He was right. Whatever this was between them, whatever remained after years of distance and longing, it was real. It had always been real. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Raphael exhaled, turning his hand over so their palms met. His touch was warm, grounding. "Then let's figure it out together," he said. And just like that, the past didn't seem quite so insurmountable. The shadows of what had been still lingered, but they weren't just ghosts of regret. They were proof of something that had never truly died. And as Elise looked into Raphael's eyes, she realized maybe they didn't have to be afraid anymore. Maybe love, even after all this time, was still enough. The night wrapped around them as they left the cafe. The rain now only a fine mist, clinging to their skin like an unspoken promise. Raphael's hand lingered at her back, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. It was an echo of the past, of the way he used to guide her through the city. As if he had always known she would one day disappear. Elise stole a glance at him as they walked, her heart an unsteady rhythm in her chest. She had expected tension, perhaps even anger, but instead, there was something else between them, something fragile. Like the first breath after a long winter, they reached the edge of a quiet square. The dim glow of old-fashioned street lamps casting golden halos on the cobblestones. Raphael stopped, turning to her, his expression unreadable. "Come with me," he said softly. Elise hesitated. She had already made one choice tonight by staying. But this was something more. This was stepping beyond the safety of words, of nostalgia, and into the unknown. Raphael must have sensed her uncertainty because his voice dropped lower, more certain. "I don't mean forever, just for tonight. Let's stop pretending we don't need this." Her pulse thrummed. Did she? Yes. She nodded, and Raphael took her hand, leading her down streets she barely recognized anymore. They reached an old apartment building, the kind with wrought iron balconies and ivy climbing up the stone facade. Inside, the air was warm, the scent of aged wood and something faintly familiar surrounding her. His home, it was different from the place she had once known, but there were remnants of him everywhere, the neatly stacked books, the half-drunk glass of wine on the counter, the scent of leather and something that was uniquely his. Elise hesitated in the doorway. "This feels like a mistake." Raphael's voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "No," she said quickly. "Like a memory I'm afraid to lose again." He studied her for a long moment before stepping closer, his fingers trailing up her arm in a touch so light it sent a shiver through her. "You never lost me," he murmured. The space between them disappeared. Raphael kissed her, slow and careful, as if testing whether time had truly changed them. Elise melted into him, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. The years between them faded in that moment, leaving only the aching familiarity of his touch, the quiet certainty that, despite everything, this asterisk had never truly ended. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling in the dim light, Raphael rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. Elise closed her eyes. She had spent so long running from him, from herself, from the fear that love was not enough. But now, with his hands on her skin and his heart in his voice, she realized something. She was tired of running. She pressed a kiss to the corner of his mouth, a silent answer. And for the first time in years, she let herself fall. The night stretched endlessly around them, wrapping them in a cocoon of warmth and whispered longing. As Elise lay in Raphael's arms, her fingers traced absent patterns against his skin, her mind caught between the past and the present. The weight of what they had done, of what they were doing, settled deep in her bones. Raphael's breath was steady against her hair. His body relaxed in a way that told her he had waited for this moment as much as she had feared it. His fingers brushed against her back, slow and lazy, as if he were memorizing her all over again. She should have been content, but doubt still crept in like a thief in the dark. "Do you regret it?" she whispered, barely able to voice the question. Raphael shifted slightly, angling his head so he could look at her. His eyes, dark and searching, held no hesitation. "No, never." Elise exhaled, relief washing over her. But it was not enough to quiet the storm in her mind. "This doesn't change what happened," she murmured. "It doesn't erase the years apart, or the fact that I left." His hand stilled against her spine. "I know." She bit her lip. "Then what does this mean?" Raphael was silent for a long moment, as if weighing his answer carefully. Finally, he said, "It means I still love you. It means I'm not going to pretend I don't." Elise swallowed hard. It was so simple for him, so absolute. She wanted to believe it could be the same for her, that love alone could be enough to bridge the distance time had carved between them. But love had never been the problem. It was everything else: the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that wanting something didn't always mean you were meant to have it. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Raphael brushed his lips against her forehead, lingering. Then let's figure it out together. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to fall into the safety of his words, to let them wrap around her like a promise. But doubt was a cruel thing. And in the quiet hours of the night, when Raphael finally drifted into sleep, Elise lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if love, no matter how deep, was truly enough to hold them together this time. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the room. Elise stirred before Raphael, slipping from the bed carefully so as not to wake him. She stood by the window, pulling the sheet around her as she stared out at the city she had once called home. It felt different now. Or maybe she was different. Raphael shifted behind her, and a moment later she felt his warmth at her back. His arms circled her waist, his lips pressing lightly against her shoulder. "You're thinking too much," he murmured against her skin. Elise sighed. "I don't know how not to." Raphael turned her gently so that she faced him. "Then tell me what you're afraid of." She looked up at him, searching his face for answers she wasn't sure he could give her. "That we'll make the same mistakes," she admitted. "That this will end the way it did before." His gaze darkened. "It doesn't have to." "How do you know that?" "Because we're not the same people we were back then." He cupped her face, his thumb tracing a slow path across her cheek. "I know what it's like to lose you. Elise, I'm not going to let it happen again." Her chest ached at the conviction in his voice. He made it sound so easy, so certain. But certainty had never been her strength. She pressed her forehead against his chest, closing her eyes. "I don't want to hurt you again." Raphael exhaled, his arms tightening around her. "Then don't." It was such a simple answer, and yet it held more weight than anything else. Could it really be that simple? Could they really choose to stay, to fight for what they had lost? She wanted to believe it, and for now, maybe that was enough. She tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. "Okay?" Raphael's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Okay?" Elise nodded. "Okay?" And with that single word, she chose to stay. For now, for as long as love would allow. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope between past and present. Elise and Raphael fell into an unspoken rhythm. Late mornings, filled with quiet touches and slow kisses. Afternoons spent wandering through the city as if reclaiming lost time. And nights where the silence between them carried the weight of all they had not yet said. But beneath the tenderness, beneath the warmth of rediscovery, there was something fragile, something uncertain. Elise could feel it in the way Raphael sometimes hesitated before touching her, as if afraid she might disappear again. She saw it in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, as if trying to decipher whether she was truly here to stay. And she felt it in herself, the constant pull between wanting this, wanting him and the lingering fear that love was not enough to outrun the ghosts of the past. One evening, as they walked through the narrow streets near the Seine, Raphael broke the silence. "You're still thinking about leaving?" Elise froze mid-step. She turned to him, her heart hammering. "I." He held up a hand, stopping her before she could deny it. "Don't lie to me, Elise." His voice was quiet but firm, his gaze steady. "I can see it in your eyes." She swallowed hard, the truth thick in her throat. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You're here, with me, but it still feels like you have one foot out the door." Elise looked away. She hated how well he knew her, how easily he could unravel the defenses she had spent years perfecting. "I don't want to hurt you again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Raphael let out a hollow laugh. "You keep saying that, but leaving would hurt more than anything else." Tears burned at the edges of her vision. "And what if I stay and we fall apart anyway? What if we ruin this?" He stepped closer, his hands settling on her arms. "Then at least we tried." Her breath caught. "You're afraid of what happens if we fail," he continued, his voice softer now. But have you thought about what happens if we don't? Elise stared at him, her heart aching. She had spent so long fearing the worst, so long convincing herself that leaving had been the only way to protect them both. But what if she had been wrong? What if this love was worth the risk? Raphael searched her face, his grip on her tightening just slightly. "Stay," he whispered. "Not just for tonight. Not just until the fear catches up to you again. Stay because you want to." The city moved around them, life continuing as if this moment between them did not carry the weight of everything they had ever been. Elise took a slow, shuddering breath. And then, finally, she let go. "Okay," she said. Raphael exhaled, relief flickering across his face. He reached for her, his fingers threading through hers as if grounding himself in her presence. And for the first time in years, Elise felt something shift inside her. Maybe this time, love really could be enough. Maybe, this time, she wouldn't run. The days stretched into weeks, and Elise found herself settling into a life she had once thought impossible. She and Raphael fell into an easy rhythm, waking up tangled in each other's arms, sharing slow breakfast with coffee that always turned cold from too much talking, and wandering through the city as if mapping out a new version of their love. It was tender, intoxicating, and yet, beneath it all, Elise still felt the weight of the past pressing against the edges of their happiness. She saw it in the way Raphael sometimes hesitated before asking her things, as if bracing for the moment she would pull away. She saw it in herself in the way she flinched when conversations turned to the future, afraid to make promises she wasn't sure she could keep. And then came the night when everything cracked. They had been out late, a quiet dinner turning into a long walk along the river. The streets were nearly empty, the glow of the city reflecting in the dark water. It should have been perfect, but something had been weighing on Raphael all evening, and Elise could feel it in the silence between them. When they reached his apartment, she turned to him, bracing herself. "What is it?" Raphael hesitated, his fingers tightening around the keys in his hand. Then he looked at her, and the rawness in his gaze made her stomach twist. "I need to ask you something," he said. Elise swallowed. "Okay?" His jaw tensed. "If I hadn't found you that night at the cafe, would you have ever come back?" Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because she didn't know. She had spent so long convincing herself that staying away had been the right choice, that Raphael deserved a life without the uncertainty she carried with her. And yet, standing here now, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Her silence was answer enough. Raphael exhaled sharply, turning away. "That's what I thought." Raphael as she reached for him, but he stepped out of her grasp. "This is what I mean, Elise." His voice was quiet, but edged with something sharp, something unraveling. "You're here now, but I don't know if you're really here. And I don't know if I can keep doing this if I'm always waiting for the day you decide to leave again." His words hit like a fist to her chest. "I'm trying," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'm here, aren't I? But is it enough?" His eyes searched hers, desperate for something she wasn't sure she could give. She wanted to tell him yes. She wanted to promise that she would never leave again. But the words lodged in her throat, stuck behind years of fear and uncertainty. Raphael shook his head, his expression pained. "You can't even say it." Tears burned behind her eyes. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" His voice was rough. "Because you're afraid. Because love wasn't enough before." She flinched. Raphael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Elise, I love you. I always have. But I can't be the only one fighting for this." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, quietly, he said, "If you're going to leave, do it now." Her breath hitched. "I can't go through this again," he continued, his voice hoarse. "I can't wake up one day and find you gone. So if you don't think you can stay, just go." The words shattered something inside her. Because this was it. This was the moment she had been running from. For years, the moment when she had to decide if love was truly worth a risk. And for the first time, she realized something. Leaving hadn't been the hard choice. Staying was. Elise stepped forward, reaching for him. I don't want to go. Her voice was shaky, but it was the truest thing she had ever said. Raphael's breath hitched, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. Elise swallowed hard. I'm scared. I don't know how to do this without ruining it. But I know that leaving won't fix anything. And I know that I don't want to wake up without you. His expression softened, but the tension in his shoulders remained. Then stay. She nodded. I will. A pause. Then, cautiously, Raphael reached for her, his fingers brushing against hers before entwining fully. And this time, Elise held on. Not just for tonight. Not just until the fear returned, but for as long as love would allow. The days that followed were different. Something had shifted between them that night. Something fragile but real. For the first time, Elise wasn't just with Raphael, she was choosing him. Over and over, even when the fear whispered that she should run. And Raphael, he still watched her carefully, still seemed to brace for the moment she would slip away. But there was something softer in the way he held her now. Something patient in the way he kissed her. As if he had decided to believe in her promise, even if part of him was still afraid. But trust was not rebuilt in a single night. One evening, as they sat curled on the couch with a bottle of wine between them, Raphael traced his fingers over the inside of her wrist, where her pulse beat steady beneath his touch. You never told me why you left, he murmured. Elise's breath caught. She had spent so long avoiding this conversation, afraid of what it might unearth. But if she wanted this truly wanted them she couldn't keep running from the truth. She exhaled slowly. I was afraid. Raphael's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He simply waited, his thumb still moving in slow circles against her skin. I loved you so much it terrified me, she admitted. I kept thinking, what if we ruined it? What if we turned into something bitter and broken? I thought leaving was the only way to stop that from happening. Raphael's jaw tightened. And did it work? The question hit her like a punch to the ribs. Because of course it hadn't. Leaving hadn't protected them. It had only given them years of silence, years of wondering. Years of pain that could have been avoided if she had just stayed. No, she whispered. It didn't. Raphael's expression softened, but there was something aching in his eyes. Elise, love isn't about guarantees. It's not about knowing we won't hurt each other. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard. Tears burned behind her eyes. I know that now. A long silence stretched between them. And then Raphael exhaled, pressing a kiss to her palm. Just don't run again. I won't, she promised. And this time, she meant it. But love was not just about words. It was about proving, day after day, that she was staying. It was in the way she reached for his hand first. In the way she let herself talk about the future, even when it scared her. In the way she whispered, I love you not just in the quiet of the night, but in the bright light of day, where fear had no place to hide. And slowly, trust began to bloom again. One morning, as they lay tangled together beneath the sheets, Raphael traced a finger along the curve of her jaw. Move in with me. Elise's breath hitched. Raphael watched her carefully, his eyes steady. I know it's fast. I know we're still figuring this out. But I want you here. I want to build a life with you. Panic surged in her chest, the old fear clawing its way back. But then she looked at him, the man who had never stopped loving her, never stopped waiting for her to find her way back. And suddenly, the fear didn't feel quite so heavy. She exhaled, a slow smile curving her lips. Okay? Raphael blinked, as if he hadn't expected her to say yes so easily. Then, slowly, he smiled too. Okay, he echoed. Elise nodded. Okay? And as Raphael kissed her, laughter slipping between their lips, Elise knew this time she wasn't running. This time she was home. The transition into living together was both exhilarating and terrifying. Elise had never truly shared her space with someone before, not like this. Not in a way that felt permanent. There was something deeply intimate about it, more so than even the act of loving him. It was in the quiet, everyday moments, the way their lives intertwined in the simplest of ways. Raphael left his books scattered around the apartment, his notes filled with half-written thoughts she wasn't meant to see. Elise brewed coffee in the morning, always making enough for two, even before she was fully awake. They argued about where to put things, laughed at how different their routines were, and fell asleep each night in the same bed, wrapped in the kind of warmth that made her wonder if she had ever been afraid of this. But love was not just about shared moments and whispered promises. Love was learning to stay when things got hard. The first test came in the form of an unexpected storm. Not the kind outside, but the kind that settled between them on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Elise had been working late, trying to meet a deadline, and by the time she made it home, exhaustion pressed heavy against her bones. She had barely stepped through the door before she saw it. An open suitcase sitting by the closet, half filled with Raphael's clothes. Her heart lurched. For a single, shuddering moment, she thought is leaving. Panic seized her chest before she even realized she was speaking. Are you going somewhere? Raphael, who had been folding a shirt, turned to her with an easy smile. A work trip, just for a few days. But the damage was already done. Elise knew her reaction was unreasonable, that a few days apart was nothing compared to the years she had spent running. And yet, the sight of that suitcase had cracked something open inside her, something raw and unhealed. She turned away, swallowing hard. You could have told me. Raphael frowned. I assumed it wasn't a big deal. Well, it is, she snapped, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Raphael stared at her, his expression shifting. Elise. His voice was cautious now, as if he was realizing just how deep her fears still ran. I'm not leaving. I'll be gone for 3 days. That's all. But logic didn't quiet the panic clawing at her ribs. Just as she exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temples. I know it's stupid, but I don't like surprises like this. Not when it comes to this. Raphael was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, he said, You really thought I was leaving, didn't you? Elise flinched. Because yes, somewhere, deep down, she had. Even after everything, even after choosing to stay, a part of her still feared that love was something that could slip away without warning. Raphael set down the shirt in his hands and closed the distance between them, reaching out carefully, as if afraid she might bolt. Elise, he murmured, his hands coming to rest on her arms. I need you to believe me when I say that I'm not going anywhere. Not permanently. Not without you. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. I do believe you, she whispered, most of the time. Raphael sighed, his forehead resting against hers. Then we'll work on the rest. She let out a shaky breath, nodding. Because that was the thing about love. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without fear, without pain, without moments of doubt. But it was choosing to fight for it anyway. And as Raphael kissed her, slow and steady, Elise knew this time. She wasn't running. This time, she was staying. Time softened the edges of Elise's fear. She didn't wake up every morning afraid that love would slip through her fingers. She didn't flinch at the sight of Raphael's suitcase by the door. Didn't panic when he left for short trips. Didn't brace herself for an ending before it had a chance to begin. Because love was not about guarantees. It was about trust. And trust was something they built, day by day, in the smallest of ways. It was in the way Raphael called her every evening when he was away. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to hear her voice. It was in the way Elise made space for him, not just in the apartment, but in her life, in the future she once feared to imagine. It was in the fights that no longer ended in distance, but in understanding, in the whispered apologies, in the choice to stay. One evening, months after they had begun this life together, Raphael found her standing by the window, staring at the city below. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" Elise leaned into him, letting his warmth settle around her. "How different things feel." Raphael pressed a kiss to her temple. "Different how?" She smiled softly. "Like I finally stopped running." His hold on her tightened slightly. "You did." Elise turned in his arms, looking up at him. "Do you remember what you asked me that night? When you found me at the cafe?" Raphael nodded. "I asked if you would have ever come back." She swallowed, emotions tightening in her chest. "I think I was always meant to." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. "Then I'm glad I found you first." She kissed him, slow and deep, letting the moment settle between them. Because love was not about never being afraid. It was about choosing to stay anyway. It was about taking the risk, knowing the reward was worth it. It was about learning that running never protected the hot only love. Only trust, only the willingness to be seen and to stay, could do that. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other, Elise knew this was love. Not perfect, not without fear, but real. And that was enough.